Okay, questions? Yeah.
You talk about these close economic, socio-economic values, which are basically not there. But when I talk with water authorities, I feel that they are afraid that there is no social, how do you say it? No social encounter with this project. They are happy with the end results, but before they are very. And I think that if you put the price next to it, a lot of the society will basically say, no, we are not going to do it for the purpose.
There are lots of tools available, and you'll hear in the conference actually, Roy Brouwer and people will look at the ecosystem services approach, where you can actually look at the cost of the measures, which we can more or less work out. But what the benefits are very difficult. So you've actually got to build up the multiple benefits that come from it, not just the restoration measure as it stands alone. And there are, if you use the ecosystem services framework, you can actually do that. But to put real value on it is the problem. And there are tools available, but they're expensive to monitor and do. So if we can get that information from other restoration activities, that's great. But as I said, it's not necessarily available. But the knowledge is there, so you can actually start to, you don't have to put dollar, euro value on everything necessarily, but you can actually say if you improve your habitat in this particular area, or you put bends back in the river, it becomes socially acceptable to people. So rather than have a channel that nobody wants to walk along, you've got a nice meandering river and people want to go there. So there's a social benefit which has a value, and they've got to actually explain that to people. So it's a much wider approach. You've got to start thinking much wider on it.
Yeah, I understand it, I agree with it, but
yeah.
I have the feeling that if you really put the price for people before the project, and also they can see the end result, I think the society will not support this.
It depends.
At least that's what I think the water authorities in the Netherlands have kind of the same feeling, and I think that friction causes that there is no economic goal.
But a lot of it's caused by people not talking to the stakeholders. So all the way through the whole project cycle and the planning process, you've got to talk to the stakeholders and you've got to engage with them and find out what their needs and aspirations are. It's not just necessarily what the restoration, it's the habitat restoration is, it's actually what people's aspirations are. So you've got to engage between the two, and that's what the project cycle will do. It makes you talk to people all the way through it and find out what they want. So when you're setting objectives, they're not necessarily objectives for habitat improvement, they are social objectives, they're economic objectives, which will give you benefits. I mean, some of the classic ones, if you improve water quality, for example, and you're taking water out further downstream, and the water quality problem is upstream, you can actually then, there's a reduction in cost of water quality, cleaning up your water for drinking or whatever other source you use it. And the benefits are seen further downstream. And you've got to look at that, the catchment as a whole, and not look at each restoration measure in isolation. And when you do that, the economics actually does start working out, very much so. And so you've got to explain it. It's engagement, basically. And we don't do enough of it. We really don't do enough of it. Yeah.
When we talk about identifying measurable objectives, so in the field yesterday we saw a pretty clear example of a physical objective that was easily measurable with that velocity rate that they were targeting in summer. But when we talk about ecological objectives, what is an example of a measurable objective, and how do you do that for the ecology side?
It's often setting it in relation to, ironically in these cases, a water framework directive, so you want to get certain fish species back that you'd expect in that particular area, you want to get certain macrophytes, you want to get certain invertebrates back. I mean, the macrophytes is a classic, they wanted the ranunculus, if you remember. So ranunculus is actually quite an important species in Europe, because it's these ranunculus beds are now being disappearing, so they're on the Habitats Directive. So to see that ranunculus was quite important to them. So that's a target. So, but what's the coverage? Do you just want it there, or do you want 20% of the river area to be covered in ranunculus or even more. And you bring that back, and you bring back the invertebrates, and then you bring back the fish, so they roll on. So you can actually set targets, and that's what the Kissimmee project actually does. It sets clearly defined. We want ranunculus, we want bulrush, or we want whatever it is, covering a certain percentage of that area, a defined area. The last site we went to, you know, to me that was, it looked nice, but they've created problems there. I would have thought that they're going to have to do some management of that vegetation at some stage, otherwise they're going to have floods, but they seem to think not, because they're not worried about the houses on the right side. But I think if you want to talk about social objectives, those people, I don't think would be very happy if they had flooding outside their house. Potentially could affect them. So you've got to set clear targets against species, is often the case, because they are driven by biological quality elements. In general terms. So you've got to, what density of fish do you want in X site or Y site? Yeah. But you've got to know, that's where you get the reference condition. Or have a look at it in a site that you really do think is good, and you want to try and achieve that. What's the density of salmonids, or what's the density of coverage of ranunculus? So you've got to compare it. Yeah.
I guess that was one thing I was thinking in terms of small community scale projects. I mean, how do they go about doing that if they're quite resource constrained in terms of expertise and also finance? Like, through the reform project, is there ways for smaller groups to link into that kind of information to develop? Because that's, you know, that's quite a technical kind of objective. So how do people without that resourcing?
I mean, all the information is available on the wikis. You'll have a look at it over the next day or so. It's all available there for you to actually sort of make decisions. The big problem you've actually got is bringing together the experts with the local people and the stakeholders, and that's the engagement we're just talking about. You really do need that. I mean, in the UK, what we do, we have this thing called the catchment-based approach, and a lot of it is about community engagement. So you actually bring people together in meetings to discuss what you're going to achieve, whether it is feasible, and whether there's the finance available to actually achieve what you want. And that's often the constraint, is how much money is available. In the UK, we're actually trying to reduce costs by getting volunteers to do it, which is nice, but actually it has big constraints in its own right. Yeah.
When we talk about reference conditions and benchmarking, before historic information, do you think that the historic or the past of the river is the target and will be the best productive system, or because the system cannot be recovered as it's now, and you can, with your knowledge, put it better than it was in natural condition, or don't you know? You think that better in natural is better?
Anybody that knows me very well knows I hate the word restoration, because restoration is to put it back to its original condition. And I'm not old enough to know what the original condition is. So actually the measures that we actually do and benchmarking, we've got to set it to something that's probably socially and societally acceptable, as opposed to something that is often realistic. And you often hear the word in river restoration, the term gardening, and I think quite often that's what we're doing. We're actually making it look good, but it's not necessarily actually hitting the real original status. We'll never get back to it anyway. We've probably taken some element of the functioning of the river out at some stage, so you'll never get there. So you've got to try and get the best possible objective and outcome of it.
But so, do you think that we can now, with our knowledge, manage the river in a way to put it not only more beauty but also more productive?
Yeah. Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, you have to choose the measures to achieve that, but then you've got the economic constraints on what you can actually achieve, and that's why proper cost-benefit analysis ought to be built into it.
But these states can be different from the historical states,
and they often are, because I mean, if Angela talks about river styles, and the river could be multi-channeled and all sorts, and it's actually being constrained because of flood protection or urbanisation or whatever the case may be. So you're never actually going to get there. So you've got to try and get as close to it as is technically feasible and economically viable. Yeah. So you do have constraints on it. Okay.